Now, to look at the first week of the fall sitting of Parliament, I'm joined now by three MPs from the different parties. Karina Gould is the Liberal MP for the Ontario riding of Burlington. David Anderson is the Conservative MP for the Saskatchewan riding of Cypress Hills Grasslands. And Guy Caron is the NDP member for the Quebec riding of Rimouski-Neigette, Témiscouata, les Basques. Okay, well, let's start with the question, the issue which obviously has dominated as the week ended, and that is the issue of expenses and relocation expenses for some senior members of the Prime Minister's office. Karina Gould, $200,000 plus paid to two of the Prime Minister's senior advisors. They are going to pay back about $65,000 of it. You're going back to your riding. What are you going to tell Canadians about what to make of this all?
Well, I think as has been said in question period and as the Prime Minister's office has responded to, the fact of the matter is that there are rules and procedures in place when it comes to relocating senior staff. You know, the Prime Minister's office has addressed this. These are procedures and rules that apply to top-level public servants, the RCMP, military, and including political staff. And it's a practice that's in place. However, the Prime Minister and his office have acknowledged that, you know, there needs to be a review of this procedure and has tasked the President of the Treasury Board to do such.
I guess the question is, though, I mean, if Gerald Butts and Katie Telford decide and say in their Facebook posting last night that we don't feel good about this and we're going to return $65,000 of it between the two of them, if they don't feel good of it, why did it happen? Why did the Prime Minister sign off on it, more than $200,000 of moving expenses, and why did they accept it? I mean, that's the question people are still asking.
Sure. I mean, I'm not in the Prime Minister's office, so
yeah.
I can't tell you, exactly why that happened. However, it has been practice. I mean, it's something that happens when you move senior staff from around the country to work here in Ottawa, whether they're political staff or public servants. But I think that the Prime Minister's office is addressing this. They have recognized, what they need to do, and they're taking action to do just that.
Okay, David Anderson, your party has been hammering away at this issue. It was pointed out in the House of Commons today that Stephen Harper, when you were in government, Stephen Harper, his Prime Minister's office did okay about $300,000 of expenses for relocation, and one person received about $93,000. Is this sort of a question of if you live in a glass house, you don't throw stones?
Well, my understanding is if they found any money like that, there's been several moves by one person. It wasn't $93,000 for one person moving, but this really brings into question the Prime Minister's judgment, and I think the other issues we're going to talk about do that as well. He's the one who signed off on this, so he has senior staff who come in here, make these claims. They've got what they call personalized cash payouts, which none of us know what means, but they're paying some money back. And the interesting thing was, it was the same people who said, we've basically broken these rules, we're going to pay the money back, and then we are announcing that we're going to do a review as well. So it was, I think, on the same Facebook posting, we're sorry we did this, we're announcing we're going to do a review. So I don't know how much we can trust that this is going to be a thorough review or one that's done properly. But just because the rules are in place doesn't mean that Liberals have to abuse them, and we've seen this happen numerous times over the past few months, so it's not a surprise that this has come up again. But it's the Prime Minister's judgment that's its question here. He's the one who signed off on it. He must have looked at these. He must have realized this is almost $200,000 and some for two people moving 4 hours, and I'm going to sign off on this because they're my friends and they deserve this money.
Okay. It doesn't make any difference to you when they say, well, these levels of remuneration or relocation expenses were all by the books. This is what's on the books for senior government civil servants.
Well, there's rules and regulations on the books. You don't have to abuse them, and that's what the Liberals have shown as a consistent pattern. They don't have any consideration for taxpayers' money. The middle class is paying these bills, and these people think they can run up $125,000 and $100,000, another $100,000 in another office, $115,000 in another office for moving expenses to move to Ottawa. Canadians don't get that opportunity, and they're sick and tired of having to pay these bills.
Okay, Guy Caron, on behalf of the NDP, what's your party make of this? Is this a big issue for you or lesser? I mean, I noticed today in question period you weren't up on, your party, your MPs were not up on this issue. You're up on a whole bunch of other issues.
Yeah. Well, it's a big issue. I mean, obviously, the management of taxpayers' money is an issue that everybody should be concerned with. What we found really interesting is at the beginning, the Liberal government was replying by just saying, well, there's nothing to see here, no problem. It's all rules and regulations that have been respected. And that actually didn't fly for very long. And now the excuse is that, well, we did it because the Conservatives did it before. At some point, what Canadians are looking for is basically taking responsibility for what happened, and also don't try to claim the high ground on this, especially since the two individuals in question have said they'll be repaying part of the expenses. Doesn't mean that they basically have taken responsibility. They are doing it because they've been cut. And at some point, Canadians are rightfully asking, how can you justify one move for $120,000 and another move for $90,000? I mean, what Canadian, what would be the expense of an average Canadian moving 4 hours from one's place? $120,000 is very difficult to actually justify, and I think the government has been unsuccessful in trying to justify it.
Okay, Karina Gould, I want to change subjects. I want to go to another big, there are many subjects this week, but to another big subject this week, and that is, obviously, we still have Premier Li, who is in Canada, the Chinese Premier Li, continuing his visit. He's in Montreal today, but we have this visit. We also had revelations that your government is in discussions, the Canadian government is in discussions with the senior levels of the Chinese government for what's called a new security relationship at the highest level. But we're also told that that relationship will probably include an extradition treaty with China. All week long, we heard some statements from human rights groups who are really concerned about this development. Should Canadians be concerned about us talking about and signing an extradition treaty with the Chinese government?
Well, thank you, Martin. I think it's important to note that we're having discussions, we're having conversations. We're not talking about, at the point where we're actually signing something. And as someone who represents Canada globally and on the world stage in my capacity as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development, I can assure you and I can assure Canadians that when it comes to human rights, our government takes this extraordinarily seriously, and we are having these conversations on a continuous basis with our partners all over the world. When it comes to Premier Li's visit, I mean, I think we can be quite proud of some of the accomplishments that we've been able to achieve when it comes to opening up the Chinese market to Canadian goods and exports. I mean, when you talk about Canadian farmers and canola, I know my colleague David is probably pretty happy about this, and beef farmers. When we talk about the Canadian nuclear industry, the healthcare industry, pension boards, I mean, we've opened up some pretty significant markets for Canadians, for our farmers, for our small businesses, and at the end of the day, for our middle class, to ensure that we continue to grow this economy, and that's what we're going to continue to do. Okay,
David Anderson, all week long, the Prime Minister and ministers have been saying, as Karina Gould just said, this is an ongoing dialogue. We haven't committed to anything yet in terms of an extradition treaty. Why do you not trust those guarantees that Canada will try and hold out for, guarantees that there will not be human rights abuses if there is an extradition treaty?
Well, I guess I'm very concerned when our Prime Minister stands alongside the Chinese Premier and gets a lecture about how the Chinese judicial system has some credibility. We also know that just recently the Chinese government has sentenced, if I get his name right, Jia Lin, a human rights advocate, to 12 years in jail for daring to speak out against the government. And it was seen as a specific example of trying to set a chill, make him an example so that others would back off on their call for human rights. So China is not the United States, in spite of the impression that this government is trying to give, that somehow their judicial systems are similar. They're not Canada. They need to have some serious reform before we should be treating them seriously, and before we think of sending people back to that system of arbitrary detentions, torture, and execution. And just on the other issue, we're glad to see that the canola market has been kind of straightened up for the next 4 years, but we're only getting back to where we should have been in the first place. This was a trade barrier. This was not a phytosanitary barrier. It's come up before. We've done the projects with the Chinese scientists. They know this is not a science issue, and so we need to remind them they need to operate by international rules of trade and international rules of law when they're doing their trade, and when they're expecting us to treat them as an equal partner. So we're thankful that the canola is going back in, but it is now what it should have been, and should have been all along.
Okay, Guy Caron, we're going to wrap up with you. When the government says, trust us on this is an ongoing dialogue, and it's better to have a dialogue on these issues like extradition and cooperation than not.
Well, I'm really interested to see what the take of the Liberals is on human rights, because, this is not the first contact we had with the Chinese government under this Liberal government. And it seems that we're only talking about human rights when the Chinese representatives are gone. I remember that case when basically a Chinese, I think it was the president, actually lambasted a journalist for daring to speak about human rights, and then we stayed and didn't say a word until they were gone. And this seems to be the case again when we're actually not talking really about human rights, which should be a foremost consideration, in front of the Chinese delegations or the representatives. On the other side, we're seeing Chinese president and now premier actually talking openly about how death penalty is actually necessary for China, and about the fact that they can't guarantee that the people that they would be arresting will not be mistreated, and they're saying that next to our Canadian government. So I think there's really a shyness about speaking about human rights issues in front of our Chinese counterparts, and that doesn't bode well for the future. We're talking about the extradition treaty. This is something that our own government has mused about. I understand that those are not necessarily negotiations at this point, but just the fact that we might actually have an extradition treaty with a country that practices death penalty is a concern that has never been done by any Canadian government. So the fact that we are talking about that possibility, to me, rings a few bells.
Okay, well, I want to thank you. We're out of time, but I want to thank all three of you for taking part in speaking with us this week. I want to wish you a good, productive weekend in your ridings. We've got 1 week under our belts with a fall ahead of us for this fall sitting of Parliament. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.